The Stadium Series game at Ohio State is here, but does anybody care? Plus, are the Oilers in trouble? And with the trade deadline only a week away now, what are the big questions as the day approaches? All that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner from Locked On Flyers. I'm here each and every Friday with Gil Martin of Locked On Islanders. You can find us over on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts. You'll get our latest episode as soon as it's available here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. Gil, I think, before we get into the does anybody care about the Stadium Series game, one thing I do care about is Whalers Night that the Canes do. I think it's got to go. I find it increasingly disrespectful as the years go on.
Disrespectful to who? To Hurricanes
to Whalers fans.
To Whalers fans.
Yeah.
See, I like it. I enjoy Whalers Night. It's part of the team's heritage. Very rarely when teams switch cities do you see them acknowledge the heritage of the team. I mean, I think the New Jersey Devils, and I don't blame them based on the history, barely acknowledge the Colorado Rockies and Kansas City Scouts. Now, in 8 or 9 years that those teams won 8 or 9 games maybe. So I understand not wanting to emphasize that. But, to me, the Whalers were they had a really great culture around that team. It wasn't the fans' fault that they left Hartford. They left because of corporate reasons and arena reasons. And there is still a sizable fan base in Hartford and around Hartford that misses the Whalers. And I think, to do that out of 41 home games, to do that for one game each year, I have no problem with that. I like it.
I don't know. I feel like it twists the knife a little bit even more. But moving over to the Stadium Series game, which is Saturday at 1 p.m., it's at the Ohio State Buckeyes Stadium in Columbus, and it's designed to mirror the Michigan versus Ohio State football rivalry with, of course, the Detroit Red Wings in town for it. And, they played each other last night in a preview matchup where Columbus won 5-2. And we have our Red Wings guys to talk about how that went not so well for their team.
Well, the Red Wings dropped the Stadium Series primer against the Columbus Blue Jackets 5-2 in what was probably a pretty flat performance. We could agree upon that, Scotty. What'd you see in this hockey game?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even feel like it was really as close as the scoreboard indicated. Like, Columbus was pretty clearly the better team in this hockey game, which is not super encouraging going into a nationally televised Stadium Series game. Obviously, on Saturday, it'll be a really important rematch. Both of these teams right next to each other in the standings and the wild card hunt. Every time they play, it's going to be a playoff atmosphere already. And now you have, the Saturday's game is at Ohio Stadium. So I'm sure it's going to be electric, and hopefully the Red Wings can look a lot better than they did tonight.
All right, DeBrincat scores his 27th of the season. That ties his total from last year in about 23 fewer games, which is fantastic to see, but they do ultimately fall. Next up, outdoors at the Shoe in Columbus.
Yeah, so they are correct in that these teams are neck and neck in the wild card race now with that Blue Jackets win. A tremendous effort, especially in the second period by Columbus. They had 4 goals, 2 of them from James Van Riemsdyk. There was a cool batted shot from Sean Corrali in that game as well, hand to stick to net. It's very rare, but a lot of fun as well. But yeah, literally the only reason why Detroit has the first wild card spot over Columbus is because they've one more regulation win. Everything else in the standings is even for them with number of points, games played, point percent, everything. So it's a really important game. And yet, what has the league done about this game and giving it the showcase that it deserves?
1:00 in the afternoon. Yeah. On Saturday. How many other games are going on at the same time? I mean, it's not giving it the showcase. Look, as far as the outdoor games go, they should, if they're going to hold multiple outdoor games, they should showcase them and kind of have them be the only game at that time, if at all possible. I like outdoor games to a point, but I think the NHL has overdone it, and there's just too many of them each year.
Yeah. Now, I'm sorry, it is at 6 p.m., not 1 p.m.
Okay.
But that being said, there are still 13 NHL games on Saturday.
Yeah.
If you're trying to showcase a game like this, and I think it's super cool there's a game at Ohio State. They haven't had an outdoor game in Ohio before. The jerseys are absolutely fire. We talked about them,
Yeah.
right? So there are 12 other NHL games that day. So if you're a hockey fan and you're a fan of one of those other teams, you're probably watching your team's game, right?
And that's like what, 3/4 of the rest of the league is occupado at that point.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Now, so they have this game starting at 6, which probably means there's like the pomp and circumstance. So puck drop's going to be at like 6:25, 6:30, right?
Probably.
So given all that, there are 4 games that have puck drop at 7. So do they think maybe some people will log on an hour early, watch all that, and then switch over to their own game? Maybe, but that still kind of defeats the purpose. And I think, there was no way for them to have known that this would have the playoff implications that it does, given how tight the Eastern Conference wildcard race is. But still, I mean, this is a pretty big deal. This is a showcase event that the NHL loves to promote. And yet it's just buried in a sea of other hockey on a Saturday early evening.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to not give it a little more space to breathe. And, take what you said a little further. If the television portion of this starts at 6:00 and the game isn't going to start till 6:30, what are these people whose teams start at 7 Eastern time going to do? They're going to watch what? The first 2/3
Yeah, it's
of the
exactly
first
what I
period?
said. Yeah.
There's no real chance of even getting into the game. So, it's just not being properly showcased and highlighted. And you would, it's like the one thing you don't want to do if you're the NHL is to make these outdoor games mundane. You need to showcase them. Otherwise, why go through all the expense and all of the bother to hold them? You want to be able to maximize the opportunity that an outdoor game presents.
Yeah, you absolutely do. And again, like the implications of this game are huge for both of these teams. And given Columbus's dominance in that game and the fact that they're the ones in the 2 slot, like is there extra motivation for Detroit going into this game to get revenge for that previous loss? Can Columbus keep it up? Right? Who's going to be the hero here?
Yeah.
Like there's so many potential storylines that you could pull from this, and it just feels like it's getting buried in every other story. And I think with the schedule being how it was, with 4 nations and then the trade deadline, I also think the sandwiching between those two is unfortunate because we just had this huge marquee event for the NHL and everybody's focused on the trade deadline. And we're going to talk about it later in the show because of course we are. It's important, right? Having this event now in this particular time window, I think is also a little bit detrimental to its success.
It is and it isn't. I mean, I get it, but at the same time, there is like 2 weeks in between the end of 4 nations and the trade deadline. So this cuts that right in the middle. I guess it's sort of keeping big events going for the NHL for 3 consecutive weeks. So I can live with that. And I think also, while you're right, they didn't expect this to have such playoff implications. The fact that it does, it wouldn't if they did it in November.
Right. No, 100%. So, I mean, I do see like both sides of it. I just like, I'm just really mad on behalf of Red Wings and Blue Jackets fans because I think that this game deserves a little bit more space than the league has been giving it. But it should be a good one. And I, of course, will tune in for that first half hour, 45 minutes before I got to flip over to Flyers versus Winnipeg Jets.
There you go.
There's also an Oilers Hurricanes game in that 7 p.m. slot, and the Oilers have lost 5 games in a row now, and they've got to face a very tough Carolina team next. We're going to talk about those Oilers and what happened to them against Florida coming up next.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you could place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com today. That's FanDuel.com. For your shot at $150 in bonus bets. FanDuel.com. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA.
All right. So, as I said, the Edmonton Oilers have lost 5 straight games, including last night's loss to the Florida Panthers in a rematch of the Stanley Cup final. That score was 4-3 last night. And I think the question does arise, like, are the Oilers in trouble? And I think that given when you have to kind of start peaking in order to have a successful playoff run, we're kind of at that point in the season. And this is not a time to have a losing streak. But our friend Nick from Locked On Oilers is here to give us a little bit more insight into the game from last night.
Their 5th straight, the longest losing streak since the 2021-22 season. I'm Nick Zararis, the host of Locked On Oilers, after a unsatisfying and outright frustrating loss to a Matthew Tkachuk-less Florida Panthers. And the Oilers did not play a good game tonight. They looked slow. They looked unable to win a single foot race all night, and the Panthers did what they do best. They wore the Oilers down. They forced the Oilers into taking 6 penalties tonight. The Oilers penalty kill, which has struggled as of late, was great tonight, 6 for 6, but the Oilers never really were able to get established in this game, did not look comfortable. The best the Oilers could do was draw this game even at 2 on a fabulous goal from Leon Draisaitl. Gustav Forsling draped all over him, but once again, coming out of a tough loss, the conversation turns to the goaltending position. Stuart Skinner gave up a weak goal to Nate Schmidt. The decibel level around the conversation about adding a third goalie to this mix, in addition of Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard, will only increase ahead of next Friday's trade deadline. Remains to be seen whether Stan Bowman views that as a position in need of upgrade ahead of said trade deadline. Catch all of the analysis for the game. Today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, so he agrees. It's getting a little dicey in Edmonton right now. Since the Four Nations break, the Edmonton Oilers have lost to the Philadelphia Flyers, the Washington Capitals, the Tampa Bay Lightning, and now the Florida Panthers. They lost to the Colorado Avalanche prior to the break. That's the 5th loss. They have not won a regulation game in the month of February at all.
Yeah, not where you want to be. And you look at the standings, even with the 5-game losing streak, they're still only 4 points behind Vegas. But in the rearview mirror, the LA Kings right now,
Yeah.
They're 2 points behind the Oilers with 3 games in hand.
Right. Now, they're lucky in that the Canucks are kind of their own little mess, but I think that, they're gonna be in the top 3. I believe that, but being in the 3 spot is not as good as being in the 2 spot, first off, and still, there's the momentum that I talked about of being in the right mindset as you enter the tail end of the season and the playoffs, and that's the dangerous part because it doesn't set you up for success, for a playoff run, and, Nick is very clearly aware of that, as he mentioned there, and I think having seen the Oilers recently, in that game where the Flyers won, I think a lot of us kind of chalked it up to post Four Nations, that McDavid was tired. It was just like everybody was adjusting to being back. So it was kind of an anomaly. But they've played the same way in all of the games since then. To Nick's point, they've been slow, they haven't been winning those battles. And I think it is a really interesting thing to watch.
It is. And, the other issue that he brought up, which was the goaltending, that has to be a huge question right now for the Edmonton Oilers because you don't win. You don't go on even a long playoff run, let alone win a Stanley Cup without good goaltending. And if they're not getting that consistently, and so far this season they're not, that's a big problem. That's something that has to be resolved before the playoffs start, or else they're just not going to be able to come close to repeating last year's run, let alone to win the cup this time.
Yeah, and since the break, Stuart Skinner played 3 of those 4 games. Calvin Pickard played in the game against the Washington Capitals. But if you look at the Caps, the Lightning and the Panthers, what do they have in common? Excellent goaltending.
Yeah.
Right? And they end up losing those games. The Oilers have a below 900 team save percentage at 897 between their 2 goalies. They're tied for 10th worst in the league as a team, and like that does set off those alarm bells and begs the question, do they need a different goalie going into the playoffs, and does that upset the apple cart at all in terms of how the Edmonton Oilers play in front of a new goalie, because that's an adjustment as well.
That's an adjustment. And then you wonder this. You look at the save percentage of Skinner and Pickard. They're almost identical. You mentioned the team save percentage was 897. Skinner has an 898. Pickard has an 896. So you wonder whether it's the goaltenders themselves or is the team not playing consistently well in front of them. And maybe the way this Oilers team plays defense or doesn't play defense is part of the problem. And that means that if you bring in another goalie, how big of an impact will that goalie have?
Right. I think it's always a mix, right?
Yeah.
The goalie is responsible for some of the goals, but not all the goals on average, right? So I think, you look at the Oilers in their current state, and I'm not sure there's much they can do besides adding a goaltender here, given the circumstances that they're in. And they're still only allowing under 3 goals per game, but it's not as good as the other teams out there, which shows that it's a team defense issue as well, right? Because you have 12 teams that are better than them defensively when you add team defense and goaltending together in
Right.
terms of goals allowed. Like, that's not going to cut it for them to get back to the Stanley Cup final.
It is very difficult if you don't have the better goaltender in a series. The old expression, offense sells tickets, defense wins championships. You need to have that team defense cooking. And look, last year in the playoffs, Skinner did a great job. People do not give him enough credit for what he accomplished, I think, in the playoffs last year. But
Sure.
he doesn't seem to be playing at that high level right now.
Right. And I think there was kind of a Four Nations hangover for Connor McDavid. Like, I don't deny that, but Leon Draisaitl is sitting right there and he's doing everything he can, but there's not enough around him
Right.
supporting that right now, I think.
Yeah, Draisaitl has been outstanding, and you look at his
Yeah.
numbers. Everyone gives McDavid all the attention, and it's always McDavid and Draisaitl, and yet right now, Draisaitl has double the number of goals that McDavid has, and 14 more points. He's a plus 27. McDavid is a plus 3. And I'm not trying to put down Connor McDavid, but Leon Draisaitl just deserves a lot more credit. He has really been outstanding this year.
Yeah, he has. All right. Well, will the Edmonton Oilers get a goalie at a trade deadline? That is one of the big questions remaining to be asked in the week we have until that day. We're going to talk more about the trade deadline looming ahead coming up next. If you're like me, mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee. I've got one right now. I got tired of settling for the basic grocery store pods. They just weren't cutting it. So I turned to Trade, and let me tell you, their coffee is next level. Trade is the number one specialty coffee marketplace in the US. They bring you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they can handpick the perfect match for you. I found a local Philadelphia roaster that I'd always wanted to try called Reanimator. My first bag was a game changer. It had a smooth, rich flavor. I could actually taste the difference from my usual pod stuff. Their subscription makes it so easy. No more last minute grocery store runs or settling for whatever's on the shelf. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. That's drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl for 40% off your first order. Drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. All right, Gil. So the trade deadline is 1 week away. And I think there's a lot of big questions. We just talked about the Edmonton Oilers and their goaltending situation. I think, when you talk about potential goaltenders on the move, the first name that comes to mind is, of course, John Gibson, perennial trade bait, right?
Yeah. Been on that trade rumored list for a couple of years now, and still an Anaheim Duck. So go figure. And the Ducks are actually quietly better than anyone expected them to be
Yeah.
this season. So how eager will they be to move John Gibson? That's a big question. But yeah, the Oilers, I think, would be a natural fit. And I don't think there's a lot of goalies out there right now, quality goalies available at the trade deadline. So that'll be an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the other biggest question out there for me is, will Mikko Rantanen get moved again after the big deal that sent him to Carolina? As we know, Carolina offered him a contract extension to make him the highest paid Carolina Hurricane in history, and he turned it down. So I think, there have been rumors out there and reports out there that they're willing to take the risk to keep him as an asset because he's a really good player and they need him in this playoff run. But that being said, the haul that they could potentially get in return that could also help them in a playoff run. If Rantanen just doesn't want to sign in Carolina, like, there's something to be said for that as well.
Yeah, there is, and all eyes are going to be on that Rantanen situation. Such a talented player, and he could be a potential game changer for any team that acquires him. Not to mention what Carolina could get in return for trading him. A lot of the power dynamics in the league could shift based on that trade, depending on what it is, if it goes down.
Yeah, I think so. And it's a very fascinating situation. I think that, if a guy is unhappy at a particular team and he has earned the right to his free agency status at the end of the year. He should be able to do what he wants. It does put Carolina in a difficult situation, but that was a risk that they took in making the trade with the
Right.
Avalanche in the first place. So I think it's going to be fun to watch from an outside perspective. I think if you're a Hurricanes fan, maybe you're a little stressed out about it.
Yeah, that's a little nerve-wracking, absolutely, if you're a Hurricanes fan. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Carolina decides to handle the situation. They took a gamble, and now it's the crossroads. They've got to figure out, now that they know that they're having difficulty signing him, where do you go from here?
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Ducks being better than they potentially would have been otherwise. Of course, besides John Gibson, Trevor Zegras is always on people's minds as trade bait. Will he get moved?
I'll believe it when I see it. They have been rumored to be, I've heard the rumors that Trevor Zegras is available and so forth and so on for a long, long time, and he is still an Anaheim Duck. Right now, he's suspended, right? So, but I don't think that'll affect, his tradability at this point. I think he stays right now, especially with Anaheim 7-2-1 in their last 10 games.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Now, another big question is about the Ottawa Senators, right? They've lost 5 in a row. They had been kind of more in the playoff hunt and now slightly less so. Could they turn into sellers? And is Anton Forsberg, one of their goaltenders, like on the block here?
Yeah, that's a possibility. I don't know if the Senators will sell that readily. I think there is such a hunger in Ottawa right now to make the playoffs and end their playoff drought. Right now, they are 4 points out of a playoff spot with 1 game in hand. I think they're still close enough, unless their losing streak continues to the deadline. I think they're more likely to go for it than to be sellers.
Yeah, I just think if they're gonna strategically sell and still maintain a playoff run, he's the one guy you can trade
Yeah.
because they do have some up and coming goaltenders that could take the backup role. Like Linus Ullmark is obviously their starter and will take on the lion's share of the load in net. So to me, if you want to make a deal that could get you some additional support in return or a draft asset or whatever it is that they want, but still kind of maintain the same group going forward, Forsberg is the one guy that you can trade.
Yeah,
In
that would become a win-win. The only
Mhm.
difference is that you're then going to ride Olmark for the rest of the season and the playoffs, but you're probably going to do that anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Now the another team that has kind of fallen off a little bit is the Montreal Canadiens. I think they're still in it, but not quite as much as they were before. They've got a couple of potential, trade chips out there. David Savard, Jake Evans. Like, do we think they're gonna be a little bit sellers or big sellers or just kind of stick with it?
I think they're going to be a little bit sellers. I think, most people did not expect Montreal to make the playoffs this year. So what they've already accomplished is sort of ahead of schedule and a little bit of a bonus. Uh, they are the problem in the East is there are just so many teams. So yeah, Montreal is 5 points out of a playoff spot, but they would have to pass 4 teams to get
Right.
there. And they have another team 1 point behind them, another team 2 points behind them. It is going to be difficult. So a sort of light sell to sort of add some assets and build toward next year, when I think the Habs have a much better chance of playoff contention. I think that makes the most sense.
Yeah, and then of course, your New York Islander Brock Nelson is another kind of perennial trade rumor. You have said in the past that you don't think that Lou's going to trade him, but has that tune changed?
No, in fact, yesterday on Thursday, in an interview with Pierre LeBrun, Lou said that Brock Nelson is an integral part of the New York Islanders, and he's a member of our team. So either he's trying to increase the haul he'd get if he does trade him, or
Right.
he's still trying to re-sign him, and I tend to think it's the latter.
Well, I think there'll be a lot of turned heads if he actually does get traded. I think another forward out there is Rickard Rakell. That would be a very good asset, and the Pens are definitely not making the playoffs. So I think the Pens would do themselves a huge favor by trying to trade him. He's expensive and has 3 more years left on his deal, but I still think it's doable if they're willing to retain, and the Pens do have the cap space to do it. So maybe look for that as well. But there are a ton more questions remaining to be answered. We'll find that out over the course of the next week, and we will look forward to recapping the trade deadline a week from today. That'll do it for today's show. Gil, of course, will be back on Monday talking with hosts from around the Locked On NHL channel about what's going on with their teams. And thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your next listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey, become a fantasy hockey expert, get the edge over league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a great day, everyone.